Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday. Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. It's so annoying that Facebook keeps doing that. Okay. We are broadcasting to Facebook, no problem there. But on the home monitor, it keeps telling me that the broadcast ended when it didn't, and I just have to refresh. If it ever says like it seemed like it ended when we didn't end, just hit refresh. That often gets it started again. But it's still acting funny because I can't see the comments. I know we're broadcasting. There we are on YouTube. Ella's in the house. Chaim in Florida. Aoife in Florida. Ilanit in Silver Spring. This time tomorrow, you will be celebrating the premiere of Guns N' Moses. Bezrat Hashem. Amen. 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 Marjorie in the house from Georgia. Welcome. What is going on Facebook? I can't see the comments. I mean, in a moment, I'll just move on. Oh, here we go. Okay. Stephen in New Hampshire, Bella in Florida, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Yehud in South Carolina, Shandora in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Guy in Ohio. Welcome, everybody. So excited. And that is true. Tomorrow night is the big premiere of the movie. So special time tomorrow. We're going to have the class, but at noon Pacific. The Friday schedule tomorrow, Wednesday. I'll be on pins and needles, but it's just the perfect thing to do to be teaching the class with such a big commotion coming up later in the day. Okay, and today, let's catch up a little bit. We're going to do a double. We got a nice head start yesterday on page 108, and that sets us up. So we're about halfway down on page 108a, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. And with God's help, today we'll complete our discussion of Mishnah number 8 here in chapter 9 and open Mishnah 9. Okay, so with the above laws in mind that we learned yesterday, and what we were talking about is you have an obligation, according to rabbinic law, that if you're selling a piece of land and you have a neighbor, so let's say you have a field, right? And your neighbor has the field adjoining your field. So before you sell it to some other person, you give the neighbor the right of first refusal. It can't cost you anything. It's not like you have to lose money by selling it to your neighbor in case he can't afford to pay what some stranger will pay, what the market will bear. But if he will match whatever the best offer is that you've received, then sell it to him, because obviously it's much better for a farmer to have two adjoining fields, right? He can just keep hoeing the same rows, so to speak. Much better for him. And it costs you nothing to sell it to your neighbor versus some stranger. So that's not spelled out in the Torah, I don't think. But it definitely comes under the aegis of do what is right in the eyes of the Lord, right? If it costs you nothing to sell it to your neighbor as opposed to someone else, sell it to your neighbor. So today we'll get into a little more detail about that law. So the Gemara asks, if the stranger came to consult with one of the owners of the fields, in other words, somebody is selling a field and he's going to sell it to, not his neighbor, some other guy. But this new guy is aware that there is this requirement that you should offer it to your neighbor first. So, the interloper, as it were. I mean, he's not doing anything wrong. He's just going to buy the field. But he knows that you have an obligation to sell it to your neighbor before you sell it to him. And maybe you have a grudge against your neighbor, and that's why you're not doing it. But he comes, and he's concerned that the court may step in and undo the sale and force it to go to the neighbor, right? So the stranger's not going to lose anything either. He's going to buy the field, but then they're going to force him to sell it for what he paid to the neighbor. He doesn't want to go through all that. So to make sure that that's not going to happen to him, he goes and he polls the neighbor. He's right, the neighbors. He says, I'm about to buy this field from Sal. Probably Sal should sell it to you. I assume the reason he's selling it to me is because you're not interested in buying it. But I want to confirm that. So he goes and he asks the neighbors and he says, is it true that you're not interested in buying Sal's field? They say yes. So then he goes and buys it. That's what we're talking about. So the stranger came to consult with one of the owners of the neighboring fields. And he said to him, or one of the neighbors, and he said to him, shall I go and acquire the field? And the neighbors said to him, yes, go and acquire it, as I will raise no objection. So is it necessary to perform a kinyan, an act of acquisition with him, with the neighbor, to solidify the agreement? Is it enough that the new guy comes and says, he asked the neighbors said, go ahead, buy it. Does he need to evidence that he asked them and they said they're not going to interfere and make a problem? Or does he need to make an actual kinyan? It's a very interesting, sort of legal idea here. What do you mean a kinyan? He's going to acquire the field from the seller. What is he acquiring from the neighbor? The idea is he's acquiring from the neighbor the promise that they won't interfere with this sale and say, you know what, I do want to buy it. I'm the neighbor. I get the first right. So even though you sold it to this stranger, now I'm asserting my rights and they're going to buy it from the stranger. The stranger, again, he won't lose money, but he'll lose a heck of a lot of bother and time. He doesn't want to go through that. So the question is, does he need something more formal than just asking them and extracting a verbal promise? So Ravina said, it is not necessary to perform an act of acquisition, a formal act of acquisition from the neighbor. While the sages of Nehardea say it is necessary to perform this kinyan with him. And the Gemara concludes, and the law is that it is necessary to perform this kinyan from the neighbor. So you see that this right that the neighbor has to purchase the field ahead of some outsider is a strong right, though we will see that there are a bunch of limitations to it. It's not a right that he can assert if it's going to cost the seller anything, but if it doesn't cost the seller anything, he definitely has a priority, a superior right than some outsider to come and purchase that field. And the Gemara adds, now that you have said that it is necessary to perform this kinyan, this active acquisition with the neighbor for the right to purchase the field, so if he did not perform the kinyan with him and he purchased the field, and then the field increased or decreased in value, the price fluctuation occurs in the domain of the owner of the bordering field. Meaning the buyer's purchase is considered a purchase on behalf of the neighbor, who then reimburses the buyer. Right? Since the neighbor can assert his right and say, okay, thank you very much, I am going to take it. So that means that the one who bought it, the outsider, is legally rendered like an agent of the neighbor. And that matters because of a fluctuation in value between the time that the purchaser bought it and when the neighbor asserts his right. So accordingly, if this buyer, so the buyer is the outsider, right? If the buyer bought the field for 100 dinars and the field was actually worth 200 dinars, so in order to determine how much money the neighbor must now give the buyer in order to take the field, we determine what was the motivation of the owner who sold the field to the buyer at this price. Why did he sell the field for half the market value of the field to this outsider? If he sells to everyone at that cheap price, because maybe he has a market value of 200 dinars, but he needs the money quickly and no one's going to produce 200 dinars so fast. But if he sells it, for half price, he can get the money right away because he needs it fast. So if he sells to everyone at the cheap price, the neighbor gives the buyer 100 dinars and he takes it, as the neighbor could have bought it for this sum himself. But if the owner does not sell to everyone at this price, and this buyer was given a discount that only applies to him, so then the neighbor gives the buyer 200 dinars, the market value of the field, and he takes it. Why would you sell to a particular buyer at half the price, even though you wouldn't extend that price to other people? Maybe it's his son-in-law, or maybe it's a friend. It's just somebody that he wants to give this opportunity to, and sell it at half the value. But the thing is, that is at the expense of this neighbor who should have been sold the field. Now, look at the converse case. If the buyer bought it for 200 dinars and the field was actually only worth 100 dinars, so the sages understood that the neighbor can say to the buyer, I sent you to act for my benefit, right? He didn't send him, but we said that this buyer, this outsider, is legally rendered like an agent of the neighbor. So now the neighbor could say, well, I would only have sent you to act for my benefit, but not to my detriment. Since the field will not remain in your possession, you are effectively my agent, and I am not prepared to pay more than its market value due to your mistake. Now, Mar, the elder, the son of Rav Chisda, said to Rav Ashi, this is what the sages of Nehardea say in the name of Rav Nachman. There is no exploitation with regard to real estate, as land has no fixed value, and therefore it cannot be said that the buyer overpaid and he is given whatever sum he spent. If the seller was able to find a buyer who was willing to pay him double the market price, well then, that's the new market price, because there's no fixed value for land. Even if there are comparable fields next door nearby that are only selling for half that value, okay, well, maybe this buyer wanted that particular field. He knew there was something under the ground. He had some emotional attachment to it for some reason. Whatever the cause, if the seller could find a buyer that would pay double the market value, that's the new market value. And if the neighbor now wants to step in and assert his right as a neighbor, he's going to have to pay that increased price, that double the market value price that when the seller found that buyer, that set the new price. If this neighbor wants to buy the field, he has to pay that new price. The Gemara discusses a related case. If one sold to another a base sa of land, so a certain volume of land that is enough to produce a base sa of produce. So if one sold to another a base sa of land in the middle of his property, so that the buyer is surrounded on all sides by the seller's fields. So then we see what type of land it is. Right? Do I have my... Yes, I do. Right, so you get the picture here. Right? So let's say this is Sal's property, and this is the neighbor's property. And then I find a buyer who buys a field like this in the middle of my land, right? So now, if I'm selling all this land, well, then it's adjoining my neighbor. But if I'm only selling this field, well, this field does not adjoin my neighbor. So therefore, I could sell this to some other buyer, and my neighbor doesn't have any right to step in and pay the same price that the buyer would have paid, because this field is not adjoining the neighbor's property. That's what we're talking about here. So if one sold to another a base of land in the middle of his property so that the buyer is surrounded on all sides by the seller's fields, then we see what type of land it is. Whether the land is superior quality land or whether it is inferior quality land, either way, the sale is a valid sale, as it is a distinctive piece of land. So in that case, the seller's neighbors cannot object, as their fields do not actually border on this plot of land. Now on page 108b. But if this field is not of any distinct quality, you can't say it's superior quality, you can't say it's inferior quality, you can't define it, it's just land. Well, then the seller is certainly trying to employ an artifice. His plan, or I guess the buyer's plan, is to then purchase another plot of land from this owner one that does not border on the field of a neighbor. By first buying the plot in the middle, he is trying to establish himself as a neighbor so that the other neighbors will not have the first right of purchase relative to him, right? So in other words, what the buyer is trying to do, he wants to buy this land, right? Now, really what he wants is my whole field, but he knows that if he buys my whole field, then my neighbor has the right to step in and buy it from him and take it. But he wants to get land in this neighborhood. So he buys this, which my neighbor can't object to because this doesn't adjoin his land. Then I sell him the rest of my property, right? And now my neighbor can't say anything because this new guy is a neighbor, right? He's neighbor 2. This was neighbor 1. He's now living in the neighborhood. So his land that he owns is adjoining the rest of the field, and he can buy the rest of the field. And he can say, well, I'm a neighbor too. You have no right to take this field from me. So he's trying to establish a beachhead in the neighborhood, if you understand my meaning. And the Gemara continues to discuss the law of one whose field borders that of his neighbor. Now, with regard to a gift, right? So we've established once I decide to sell a field, we find out what the market price is, and then if any of my neighbors is willing to meet the market price, I have to sell to my neighbor. Well, what about if the market price for me is not a price? It's a gift. I want to give it to my son-in-law. Can I give it to my son-in-law? And if so, can my neighbors say, well, you should have given it to me? No. I have reasons I want to give it to somebody. I don't have to give it to my neighbor. Right? With regard to a gift, it is not subject to the halacha, the law of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor, as one can give a gift to whomever he chooses. A Maimar said if he wrote a property guarantee to the recipient of the gift, that if the field is seized for payment of a debt of the giver, then the giver of the gift will compensate the recipient for his loss. Well, then it would be subject to the law of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor, because in that case, the supposed gift has a strong appearance of a sale. They just didn't record the money that changed hands with the outside world. But if he's offering a guarantee, how often does a guarantee accompany a gift? Guarantees only accompany deeds, where there's a purchase and sale of land. So it seems like they were employing some kind of false gift, and that's why we would set it aside. If a seller sold all his property to a single person, meaning, let's say that I own fields in various locations. Each of my field has neighbors, but I own a bunch of fields, and I find a buyer who's willing to take all my fields. Now, do I have to? Does the neighbor of each of one of those individual fields have a right to go to this buyer of all my fields and say, well, that you might have bought 10 fields from Sal, but one of those fields is adjoining my land, and I want that field for myself? Answer: no, because some people want to buy 10 fields, they don't want to buy 9 fields, and that is not the same. That takes it out of the realm of a sale that should have gone to my neighbor, because what I'm selling is something my neighbor can't afford. Presumably, if I'm selling 10 fields and one of my neighbors says, well, I'll buy all 10 fields, then maybe he can step in. But he can't say, I'm going to take one of those fields when I have found a buyer who's willing to take all 10. And similarly, if the seller sold it back, right? So if I'm selling a field, but the one person I'm selling it to is the one I bought it from. Now, he doesn't live in the neighborhood anymore, but he used to, right? So similarly, if the seller sold it back to the previous owners, then this sale is not subject to the halacha of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. And if a buyer bought a field from a Gentile, or a seller sold a field to a Gentile, then in this case also, this purchase or sale is not subject to the halacha of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. And now the Gemara clarifies this ruling. If a buyer bought the field from a Gentile, it does not apply, as he can say to the neighbor, it is better for you that I bought the field, as I have chased away a lion for you from the border. since the neighbor certainly prefers having a Jewish neighbor to having a Gentile neighbor, right? So the neighbor used to have a Gentile neighbor, and now the buyer is, a buyer came in who is Jewish, and he bought from the Gentile. The prior owner was the Gentile, right? And the neighbor actually cannot step in and say, well, the Gentile should have sold to me. Why can't he say that? Well, because the Gentile is not obligated in these laws. They only obligate Jews. If a seller sold a field to a Gentile, again, the Gentile is certainly not bound by the command of, and you shall do that which is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. The Gentile is therefore under no obligation to refrain from purchasing this land. Nevertheless, we do excommunicate the Jew who sold it to the Gentile until he accepts upon himself responsibility for all damage resulting from accidents that might befall the neighbor on the Gentile's account, right? He shouldn't have sold it to a Gentile. He should have sold it to the neighbor. By selling it to a Gentile, he took it out of the realm of this obligation. But to discourage doing that, we would say to him, well, okay, you sold it to a Gentile. The court will not step in and undo that sale. But if the Gentile ends up harming, your neighbor when you're leaving the neighborhood, you're going to have to make good on that. And of course, that's a strong discouragement to sell to the Gentiles. Now, it's not that there's this prejudice against non-Jews. It's that, remember, what we're talking about here is whether it was in Babylonia or in Roman times in Eretz Yisrael, not that there's not anti-Semitism today, but there was very strong anti-Semitism, and it was quite dangerous. That's why they called having a Gentile as your neighbor is like inviting a lion onto the block, because the Gentile could harm the Jew and get away with it, right? The anti-Semitism was not only strong and dangerous, but it was endorsed by the government, especially, in Eretz Yisrael under Roman rule. If some, Roman decides to make a villa in the Holy Land, a summer villa in the Holy Land, and then he ends up, exploiting or killing or torturing his Jewish neighbors, he's going to get away with it. So that's why you'd rather not invite that kind of problem into the neighborhood. Now the Gemara continues, if the seller sold a field that was previously given as a mortgage to the one to whom it was mortgaged, right? So the seller borrowed some money and he used his field as the collateral for that loan, and then he ends up selling the field to the one who lent him money. Now, why shouldn't he sell it to the neighbor? Why is he going to sell it to somebody who loaned money to him? Answer, because when he borrowed money from some outsider to the neighborhood, but who was Jewish, right? And when he borrowed money, it was not at interest, because Jews can't lend money at interest to each other, but they can have collateral, so they use this field as the mortgage collateral. At that point, the lender did acquire some kind of proprietary interest over that field, and it's like he became a neighbor already. And that's why the actual neighbor can't step in and say, no, don't sell it to this guy who lended you money. He's an outsider. Sell it to me. No, he became an insider when he loaned money to the guy who then became the seller. Right, so if he sold a field that was previously mortgaged to the one that that mortgaged it, this sale is not subject to the law of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. As Rav Ashi said, the elders of the town of Mata Mechasia said to me, what is the meaning of the word mortgage, mashkanta? It means that it resides, shekuna, with the one to whom it was mortgaged, right? Meaning the lender who took this property as collateral acquired some kind of ownership in it, and that's why you are selling to a neighbor, as it were, when you sell to this one who had a mortgage on it. And the Gemara asks, what difference does it make what the word means? The Gemara answers, it is relevant with regard to the law of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor, in that the person to whom the field is mortgaged has more rights than bordering neighbors, as he lays claim to a measure of ownership over the land already, right? In other words, he has more rights, greater rights than the neighbors, because he already has some ownership in that land. The neighbors, have a claim as neighbors, But the mortgager, the lender, he already has a claim on that piece of land. Now, if one sought to sell a distant field and to redeem, i.e. purchase for himself, a close one. So, okay, somebody would like to sell a field that's far away and use the money to buy a field that's close. Or if he sold a bad one to redeem a good one. This sale is not subject to the law of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. Rather, he may sell his field whenever he has the opportunity. The operative word here is he needed to move fast. A field became available that was very convenient for him. And he wanted to quickly sell this field that was far away so he could buy the one that was close. The speed is what matters. Because in that case, in order to give the neighbors the opportunity to step in, it's not like people have, ready cash sitting around to buy a piece of property that's as big as the one they live on, perhaps. So it would take time, right, to announce that you're selling, to give the neighbors time, to figure out if they want to buy it, to raise money so they could buy it, etc. But you had a business opportunity that was pressing, right, where you had an opportunity to buy land that you wanted to get. In that situation, you can move fast and the neighbors are out of luck. Likewise, if this one sells his field to pay for necessities, like taxes. Okay, so remember, taxes, death and taxes, right? But taxes in Rome or taxes in Bava, if you didn't pay them, you go to jail and fast, if not dead. So this could be like a life or death issue. So to sell it, if he needs to sell the field for necessities, such as to pay taxes, or to feed his wife and daughters, or for the burial of one of his family members, then this sale is not subject to the halacha of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. And this is because the sages of Neardea said, for taxes, for sustenance, and for burial, we sell a field without proclamation, right? Without announcing to the neighbors that it's being sold, as such matters are pressing and urgent and should not be delayed out of consideration for the rights of a bordering neighbor. And similarly, if he sold the field to a woman who does not usually chase after vendors, or to orphans, or to his partners, this sale is not subject to the law of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. So there are some considerations that trump the rights of the neighbor because there's other matters going on in the seller's life. If you're not sure whether your particular issue takes priority over the right of your neighbor to purchase an adjoining field, consult your local Orthodox rabbi. If various individuals have equal rights to the field, such as both are bordering neighbors. Okay, so there's two neighbors. But some of them are neighbors whose fields are adjacent to his on the side of the city, i.e. their fields are between the city and the field being sold. And the other neighbors whose fields are adjacent to his on the side of the field, i.e. their fields are between the field being sold and the area further away from the city. So the neighbors whose fields are adjacent to his on the side of the city receive precedence. I'm not sure I understand why, but it's like let the guys who are already close to the city expand their holdings outward away from the city rather than people who are, sort of further away from the city who would like to expand their land holdings inward toward the city. The ones who are expanding outward away from the city get precedence. If one is a regular neighbor and the other is a Torah scholar, the Torah scholar receives precedence. Right? And remember, this is not just because Torah scholars like Torah scholars and make sure they always win, but people studying Torah keep everyone safe. Right? The more Torah is being studied in the world, and particularly the more Torah is being studied in the Holy Land, the safer the Jews are in that region, the safer the Jews are everywhere, and the safer the whole world is. The more people studying Torah, the safer the world is. If one is a relative and the other is a Torah scholar, here too, the Torah scholar receives precedence. So then a dilemma was raised before the sages. So with regard to a neighbor and a relative, then what? What is the law? Which of them takes precedence? And the Gemara suggests, come in here and answer from the following verse, Proverbs 27:10, better a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far, meaning the neighbor takes precedence over the relative. But it seems like it's an absolute ruling, or is that a suggested guideline? A little bit unclear, right? So a Torah scholar takes precedence over both a neighbor and a family relative. If a neighbor and a relative both wish to purchase, the neighbor takes precedence. Rabbeinu Yerucham maintains that only a neighbor who is also a friend is included in this law. So again, I would say it requires further research to make sure that that's the halacha. If two people sought to acquire a field, and these coins that the first one produces for payment are good dinars, and those coins that the second uses are weighed dinars, and these are preferable to good dinars, right? Good dinars mean they look good. Weighed dinars means we know exactly what their value is. Then the one with the weighed dinars, right, the guaranteed, we know what the value of those coins is, he takes precedence, right? So somebody whose cash offer is somehow deemed to be more reliable, more worthy, more reliable, right? So in other words, two people come to buy from you, and one is going to pay cash and the other is going to pay produce. The one with cash is going to win. If both are offering cash, but one is ready cash in the coin of the realm, and the other one is cash that's going to maybe need to be checked out by some expert in money, then the one that's ready cash is going to win that auction, given as long as it's the same amount that is being offered. Good dinars versus weighed dinars. Then this field is not subject to the laws of the neighbor. You can sell to the one. In other words, the neighbor is offering good dinars. The stranger is offering weighed dinars. You can sell to the stranger. If these coins were wrapped up and those were loose, this sale is not subject to the laws of one whose field borders his neighbor, as he may sell his field to the one whose money is ready to be counted. It's not, tied up in anything, in any venture or, some kind of wrapping that was difficult to get at. If the neighbor said, I will go and expend effort and bring money, we do not wait for him. Right? The neighbor says, I'll buy it. Well, when are you going to be back? Are you going to be back in an hour, or are you going to be back in a week? You can't guarantee it. You can sell to the stranger. If the neighbor said, I will go bring money, we see what his financial status is. If he is a person who is assessed as one who can go and bring money without delay, then we wait for him. But if not, we do not wait for him. If the land belonged to one person and the houses on the land belong to another one, so the owner of the land can prevent the owner of the houses from selling his houses to an outsider, as the owner of the land is the neighbor for this purpose, and he has the first right of purchase. By contrast, the owner of the houses does not prevent the owner of the land from selling his land, as one can change his place of residence with relative ease, so he is not considered tied to the land. And similarly, if the land belonged to one and its palm trees belonged to a different person, the owner of the land can prevent the owner of the palm trees from selling the trees to another person. But the owner of the palm trees cannot prevent the owner of the land from selling his land to a stranger. If two people wanted to purchase the land, but one desired the land for building houses, and the other one wished to purchase the land for planting, right, for farming. So the settling of the land through construction of houses is preferable. And this sale is not subject to the halacha of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. So it's always a mitzvah to settle the land of Israel. Very interesting. Does this apply outside of Israel? Doesn't say. So I'm not sure if this is an absolute law or not. Definitely I understand why it would be in Israel, but maybe it's even outside of Israel. So it's kind of interesting, right? So property developers would rejoice in this law that they have a superior right over farmers because the population is always expanding and we need places for people to live. But again, this is right. Well, so you don't. The neighbor doesn't have to match the offer. In other words, the guy who's going to build houses can always outpay the neighboring farmer, and he's going to be able to do that. If a jagged edge of rock or a row of palm trees served as a barrier between two bordering fields, so then we see whether any open space exists. If the owner of the adjacent field can insert even a single furrow there that comes into contact with the other field, this sale is subject to the law of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. But if sufficient space for a furrow does not exist, then this sale is not subject to the law of the one whose field borders his neighbor, and therefore the neighbor doesn't have a right to buy it. That's only going to work if there is, literally you can farm a furrow right next to the neighbor's field. Now, in the case of those four bordering neighbors who surround a field, right? So this is going to be like this. Somebody has a field, right? And we can kind of imagine it like this, right? So these are the neighbors. Yeah. So these are the neighbors around this guy's field, and they all, want to buy the field. So who gets it? Basically, they're going to end up dividing it like this, right? His field will disappear, and the four of them will just add a corner to their fields. So if one of them preceded the others and purchased it, his purchase is a valid purchase and the other ones can't object because he's a neighbor. But if they all came simultaneously, then you would end up with that situation. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 8. Now we're on page 109a, and we start with Mishnah number 9. One who receives a field from another to cultivate for a few years, i.e. fewer than 7, may not plant flax in it, as flax greatly weakens the soil, and if a sycamore tree was growing in the field, he does not have the rights to the beams fashioned from the branches of the sycamore tree. Therefore, he may not cut down its branches for his own use, as it takes many years for new limbs of the sycamore tree to grow, like that are thick enough to be used as a beam in a house. If he received the field from the owner, he leased it for more than 7 years. So then in the first year, he may plant flax in it, and he does have rights to the beams fashioned from the branches of the sycamore tree on that land. Right? So you have more rights if you are willing to sign a lease that's 7 years or more. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara. Abaye says, although this renter, this tenant farmer, right? Although he does not have rights to the beams fashioned from the sycamore tree, the branches of the sycamore tree, if he's renting for less than 7 years, he does have rights to the value of the enhancement of the sycamore tree, i.e. the value of its growth that occurred while he was cultivating the field. Meaning, if he's watering that field and doing all the work to water that field, and the sycamore grows on account of the water that the renter is bringing into the field, so the sycamore tree ends up being worth more money, and he's going to participate in that enhancement to the land, because the land is going to be worth a little bit more when he leaves it than when he came, and he's going to get, he has a right to be paid for that. The Gemara raises an objection to Rava's opinion from a Baraisa with regard to one who receives a field from another to cultivate, and his time to leave arrives. So the court appraises its value for him. And what? Is it not that the court appraises for him the value of the enhancement of the sycamore or other trees? And, I'm sorry, I skipped the last part. And so I said that because the sycamore grows, he has the right to the value of the enhancement. Rava says he does not have rights to the value of the enhancement of the sycamore tree, right? Rava was the minority opinion who says, no, the renter was the renter, and he doesn't have right to some, because he watered the field and the tree grew, that somehow he's going to get paid for that when he leaves the land. So now the Gemara objects to Rava's opinion from a Baraisa that said specifically, with regard to one who receives a field from another to cultivate, he's renting it as a tenant farmer or as a sharecropper, and his time to leave arrives. So the court appraises its value for him. And what? Is it not that the court appraises for him the value of the enhancement of the sycamore or any other trees on the land? And the Gemara responds, no. The court appraises for him the value of the vegetables and beets that he left in the field. In other words, if the time for him to leave is before he harvests that year, then the produce that he has left, which is almost ready to be harvested, but it would be premature to harvest it now, he does get paid for that because it was his effort that created that produce, which he now has to leave behind. So the Gemara challenges this. If it is referring to vegetables and beets, let him uproot and take the vegetables and beets. And the Gemara explains it is referring to a case where the market day has not yet arrived, so that if he uproots them now, he will not be able to sell them. He therefore leaves them for the owner of the field, and he receives money instead. And the Gemara suggests, come in here another proof from a Baraisa. In the case of one who receives a field from another to cultivate, and the Shemitah year arrived, the sabbatical year, every 7 years in the land of Israel, they can't plant. So the court then appraises it for him. What does it mean that they appraise? So the Gemara expresses puzzlement over the Baraisa. Does the sabbatical year release the land from the one who contracted to cultivate it? The arrangement is in effect during this time, so why is there a need for appraisal? And the Gemara responds, rather say that the Baraisa reads like this. In the case of one who receives a field from another to cultivate, and the Yovel arrived, the Jubilee year, right? Every 50th year, any purchases or sale of land revert to the owner. Even if you buy a field outright, when the Yovel arrives, you have to give it back to the person that you bought it from, right? Every 50 years, the land returns in Israel, in ancient times, to the ancestral owners of that land. For purchase and sale of land, it reverts, because really what you're selling is crop years, not the absolute right to that land. But are we talking about purchase and sale? We're talking about a rental agreement. And the Gemara asks, but still, this is difficult. Does the Yovel release the term of a contractor? The Merciful One states permanently in Leviticus 25:23, which indicates that only land that was permanently sold returns to its owner, whereas land that was rented does not revert to the owner in the Jubilee year. You can't plant in the Shemitah year every 7 years, and you can't plant for the Shemitah year and the Yovel year, right? 2 years in a row, the land has to lie fallow. When the Jubilee year arrives, the Yovel, you can't plant there, even if you're a renter, but the Yovel does not cancel a lease agreement, only a purchase. And if you would say that so too, here it means that the court appraises it for him with regard to vegetables and beets, this cannot be, as vegetables and beets in the Jubilee year are ownerless. And this is because the Jubilee year is like the sabbatical year in that any produce that grows is ownerless and it may be taken by anyone. So rather, is the Baraisa not referring to the enhancement of the value of the sycamore that we were talking about at the beginning of this, that occurred during the time that this renter was, working that field? It must be referring to this, and therefore presents a difficulty to Rava, who says that he doesn't get the value, the enhancement in value of the sycamore that became a bigger, thicker tree during the years that he was working that land. So Abaye interpreted the Baraisa so that it is in accordance with the opinion of Rava. There, it is different. As the verse states, then the house that was sold shall go out in the Jubilee, which teaches that the house or field that was sold returns to its owner, but the value of its enhancement does not return, but remains with the buyer. The Gemara asks, well, if so, let us derive from it a general law that the value of the enhancement need not be returned. And the Gemara answers the two cases are not similar. As there, in the Baraisa, it is a sale, and the Jubilee year released it. As it is a release of the king, the Holy One above, a divine decree that says these purchases are unwound. Since the buyer had been in full ownership of the field, he keeps the value of the enhancement that occurred while it was his. By contrast, one who receives a field to cultivate it is not an owner. And the Gemara relates, Rav Papa received land as a contractor for growing hay. Okay, so Rav Papa rented a field in order to grow hay on it. During the time that he was cultivating that field, palm trees sprouted in the ground, right? But a bunch of little sprouts of palm trees. When he left the land, he said to the owners of the land, give me the value of the enhancement to the field from these palm trees. After all, this could be like hearts of palm. You could harvest this and sell that as hearts of palm. Could be quite valuable. And he grew it, right? He was growing hay, but these palm trees sprouted while he was farming that land. Maybe he planted the palms. Maybe he just got lucky. But at any rate, this field is worth more now than when he arrived, and he wants to be paid for it. Rav Shesha, the son of Rav Idi, said to Rav Papa, if that is so, i.e. if your claim is justified, well, then in a situation where there was a palm tree and it grew thick, so too would the master, meaning Rav Papa, want to be paid for the value of the tree's enhancement? But didn't Rava say that we don't do that? Rav Papa said to him, there in the theoretical case, the cultivator did not descend to the field with that possibility in mind, as the cultivator considered only the consumption of the date palm's fruit, not its growth. What do you get? Right, the fact that a trunk of a date palm got thicker, why does that make it more valuable? Right, a sycamore that grows thicker, meaning its limbs grow out, well, it's growing beams that can be cut off and used in a house. We see why they're valuable. But a thicker trunk of a palm, now you could say, well, it grows more fruit now. Maybe you could argue that, but that's not where they are. So Rav Papa said to him, in the theoretical case, the cultivator did not descend to the field with that possibility in mind, as the cultivator considered only the consumption of the fruit of the date palm, not its growth. So here in my case, I did indeed descend to the field with this in mind, as I anticipated receiving compensation for any growth of the field. Meaning all these little palm tree shoots, yeah, he planted them or allowed them to sprout up, because he knew they would enhance the value of the land, and he expected to be paid for that when he left. So the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion did he make this statement? Is it not in accordance with the opinion of Abaye, who says that he does have rights to the enhancement of the sycamore? But the Gemara says, no. You may even say that he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rava, as there the cultivator suffers no loss when the sycamore grows in the field, so that he is not entitled to the value of the enhancement as compensation. But by contrast, here there is a loss, as the palm trees that sprouted actually occupied space that he could have used for hay. He suffered a loss in order to create these sprouts, because he rented the field in order to grow hay on it, and wherever there were these palm tree sprouts, hay was not growing. So he lost a little bit, and he wants to be compensated. So Rav Shesha said to Rav Papa, but here too, the owner of the field can say, what loss have I caused you? I've caused you to lose maybe a handful of hay? Okay, so take a handful of hay and go. It really didn't interfere with growing hay. What is hay? Hay is grass, right? Grass or wheat, but it's basically, just loose growing. Hay is basically grass, right? And you chop it all down and let it dry, and it becomes hay. So you think these palm tree sprouts really got in the way of the hay? I mean, you lost like maybe 0.01% of the hay that would have grown here. Rav Papa said to him, well, not so fast. I claim that I grew garden saffron there. Forget the hay. I was going to grow some garden saffron, which is very valuable. And I couldn't because of these palm tree shoots. And Rav Papa said to him, so he claimed that he lost land that he could have used for the cultivation of expensive produce, not only hay. So Rav Shesha said to him, even so, you admit that you wanted the land for other plantings, not to plant palm trees, and you have thereby revealed your intention that you acted so as to take the produce and leave. So take your garden saffron and leave, as you have rights only to the value of the wood alone. Since you did not mean to grow these trees, you're not augmenting the field by actually growing trees, you are entitled only to the price you could have received for the palm trees had you uprooted them and sold them as wood, even as hearts of palms. That it's not going to be like saying, well, now this is a field that has an additional 100 date palms in it that are going to produce a tremendous value of dates, once they're grown, and I did that. You say, well, you didn't do that. You were just planning to, cut them down. That's what they're worth. They just have the value of shoots that are uprooted, not the potential value of 100 new date palms. So the Gemara relates another incident. Rabbi bar Abaye received land to cultivate, so he's renting it, and he surrounded it with a fence made of earth. So in the meantime, trees sprouted in it. When he left the field, he said to the owners, give me my value of the enhancement of the trees that sprouted. Rav Papi said, is it because you come from unfortunate people that you say unfortunate and unsound, legally unsound words? So it's a sharp speech there from Rav Papi, saying it to Abaye, the great Abaye. Why is he saying that? Well, because Abaye's family came from the family of Eli, whose descendants were sentenced to die at a young age. That's the story from 1 Samuel 2:32 and 33. And Rav Papi explained, even Rav Papa said only that he's entitled to the value of the enhancement of the palm trees when he has suffered a loss, as they take up part of the field. Here, by contrast, what loss do you have? As the trees sprouted in a place that would have been left unplanted, you have not lost anything, and you are not entitled to compensation. New subject. The Gemara relates, Rav Yosef had a certain planter whose job it was to plant trees, similar to a sharecropper. So the planter died, and he left behind 5 sons-in-law. So Rav Yosef said, until now, I had to deal with one person. Now, if you guys are going to step into the role of your father-in-law, there's 5 of you. I don't want to deal with 5 of you. I only wanted to deal with one guy that I knew for years. I do not now want to have a relationship with 5 of you. Until now, they did not rely on each other to plant the trees, and they did not cause me a loss, as the responsibility was their father-in-law's. But now that there's 5 of them stepping into the role previously occupied by their one father-in-law, they will rely on each other to plant the trees and cause me a loss. In other words, they're not going to be so organized. Some of them are going to say, oh, I thought you were planting. No, I thought you were planting. It's going to cause me problems. I don't want to be in a business relationship with 5 of you. Go away. So in light of these considerations, Rav Yosef decided to discontinue the agreement with them. Rav Yosef said to them, if you take the value of your enhancement that you brought to the field and remove yourselves, all is well. But if not, I will remove you without giving you the value of the enhancement. So Rav Yosef explains his statement. As Rav Yehuda says, and some say it was Rav Huna, and some say it was Rav Nachman, with regard to this planter who died, his heirs may be removed without receiving the value of the enhancement. And the guy who is renting the land and enhanced the land, he needs to be paid when he leaves. But if he dies and leaves heirs, do heirs inherit the right to the enhancement value of land that their father was cultivating under a rental agreement? Rav Yosef is saying, no, that doesn't get transmitted to the heirs. This planter who died, his heirs may be removed without receiving the value of the enhancement. And the Gemara comments, but this is not correct. The law is not in accordance with this opinion. And the Gemara relates, meaning they do get the right to the enhancement because that was money that would be owed to the one who did all the work all those years. And now you can remove them, but you're going to have to pay him just as you would have paid the one who did the work. And the Gemara relates another incident. There was a certain planter who said to the owner, if I cause a loss to the vineyard by ruining its plants, I will leave the field. So ultimately, he caused a loss to the plants, but some enhancement from the time he began did still exist. So Rav Yehuda said he leaves without receiving payment for the enhancement, while Rav Kahana said he leaves and he takes the payment for the enhancement resulting from his work. And Rav Kahana concedes that if he said, if I cause a loss, I will leave without receiving payment for the enhancement, then he leaves without receiving payment for the enhancement. But that's not what he said. He said, if I cause you a loss, I will leave. He didn't agree that he wouldn't take any payment for the value of the enhancement that he created during the time that he was there. And conversely, Rava said a promise of this kind, which he does not expect to have to fulfill, is a transaction with inconclusive intent. Right? We've seen this before, an asmachta. And the law is that an asmachta does not affect acquisition, and therefore it is not legally binding. In other words, it's something that somebody said. It was more like a figure of speech, not a legally binding contract. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rava, in what way is it different from that which we learned in the Mishna on page 104? That the recipient of the field stipulates, if I let the field lie fallow and I do not cultivate it, I will pay with the best quality produce, in which case he is obligated to fulfill his promise. And the Gemara answers there, he pays for the loss he caused. While here we deduct from him the loss that he caused and we give him the other portion of the money. right? So, okay, he does get deducted for the loss that he caused, but we set that off by the value that he's entitled to for the enhancement that he created while he was working there. The Gemara relates, I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara relates that Runya was the planter of Ravina. And he caused a loss. And Ravina removed him from his field. So Runya came before Rava and said to him, let the master see what Ravina has done to me. So Rava said to him, Ravina did well, as you caused him a loss. So Runya said to him, but Ravina did not warn me beforehand. How can he force me to leave without prior warning? And Rava said to him, in this case, it is not necessary to provide a warning. And the Gemara comments, Rava conforms to his line of reasoning, as Rava said, with regard to a teacher of children, a planter, a shochet, right, a kosher butcher, a ritual slaughterer, and a bloodletter, and a town scribe who drafts documents on behalf of the local residents. All these are considered forewarned. In other words, if you provide an important public service, you are on warning, you are on notice that if you mess up, you're fired. Therefore, any loss incurred due to them is deducted from their wages, and they are fined without the need of, not that they're fired, but they're going to have to make it good. They are considered forewarned even without prior actual warning. And the principle of this matter is, with regard to any loss that is not recoverable, they are considered forewarned. We made it to page 109b, although we're near the top. And that's where we'll pick it up tomorrow, God willing, at the special tomorrow time of noon Pacific, because tomorrow night's the big premiere of our movie, Guns and Moses. Okay, let's check some comments and questions. Sharon, what about access to the land surrounded by the seller's land? Can the buyer restrict access if he wants? I mean, it's interesting. Who's restricting access, right? If the buyer buys a field that is surrounded by the land of the seller. So we raised that case because really what he was doing is just trying to get in the neighborhood. The neighbors can't say anything because their land doesn't adjoin this little plot right within the land of the seller. And then when this buyer now goes ahead and tries to buy the rest of the seller's land, he can say, well, I'm a neighbor too, and take it. There's a different matter that we study elsewhere where land is surrounded by somebody else's land. So does he have a right of access to it? I think that's what you're asking about, right? Some kind of easement so that he can get to it. Or can the seller or just the owner of that surrounding property say, hey, it's not my problem, you bought it, you decided to buy it, or somebody sold it to me, and maybe that arrangement worked before. Like, for example, there was a pre-existing arrangement where there was a field entirely surrounded by a larger landholder's property, and that larger landholder sold it to someone else, right? And the guy with the little plot in the middle, he couldn't have bought it anyway. He couldn't afford that. And now the new guy comes and says, yeah, well, maybe my predecessor gave you the right to cross his land in order to get to your plot that's surrounded, but I'm not going to give you that right. Because really what he wants is to shove this guy out and buy that little plot from him. Can he do that? I'm not sure. It's a really good question, right? I mean, are we going to say, and I think it would be the same basis in law, do what is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. Can this, bigwig push around the little guy with that situation of the little guy's land surrounded by the big guy's land? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I don't remember the answer. It's a good question. Sharon also says, what if the seller also has a house on the property? The seller wants to sell his property to someone who wants to live in the home, which may not be the neighbor, right? So I think you were asking that before we got to it, that the one who is who owns houses doesn't really have a right. The one who owns land does have a right to say to the seller, you can't sell it to someone else, sell it to me. But the one who owns a house can't say to the landowner, don't sell that land, to some other guy, sell it to me, because the rights of a landowner are superior to those of just a homeowner on that land. Lucy. So in Talmudic times, anti-Semitism expressed itself by trying to infiltrate Jewish neighborhoods rather than excluding Jews from their neighborhood, as is more common now. I mean, I was just talking about one particular kind of example. But yeah, I mean, we definitely have read about, where Romans or, Assyrians or Philistines were much earlier, or Greeks, or just other people that were part of more powerful, peoples in the area, or marauding armies, etc. And then they decided, okay, well, you know what, I'm going to settle right here. And the Jew says, well, I own this land. He says, yeah, well, you and what army? Because me and my buddies in that army at the garrison down the street say, I'm taking this land, right? So that was a form. I mean, it's really just colonization and land theft is what's going on there. But it wasn't always so explicit. It wasn't like necessarily always done in wartime. And so there was just this fear of letting in people who could push them around like that. And you don't have to go back 2,000 years either. If you talk about, you kind of like hear how it was in Poland and Russia and Ukraine in the Pale of Settlement. The Jews, might have little holdings, but they were always in terror of the poritz, right? The local big landowner, the local noble, as it were, who very often did not behave so nobly. And it was something they were really afraid of. Bill, so if the Jubilee year doesn't cancel leases, only purchases, what is to stop a rich and not particularly ethical person not to conspire to lease more and more land in perpetual leases? That is, a lease with the renewal, where the renewal thereof is at discretion of the lessor, not the lessee, and then sublet them out at scalped rates. It seems to me that this would leave the poor little guy no recourse, little to no recourse, and they couldn't even count on the Jubilee year to return the land to the tribe and thus give them a chance to inherit it, because the rich man is technically never purchasing the land. But I think we've already seen the principle that the court will come in and examine what's really going on, right? So they will pierce the veil, as so to speak, of what is really a fraudulent transaction designed to, circumvent these laws. So if that's what they're doing, then they could say it's unethical and step in, I think. But it's a good question. That's what I've got for us today, with God's help. Tomorrow, special time, noon Pacific on Wednesday, we'll continue continue page 109 and get into page 110. Have a great night.